very much, Helen. Thank you. It's great to be here. Unfortunately, only virtually, but still, it's good to be able to talk about this. So I will attempt to get this technology working. If someone could let me know if that's working and you can now see my screen. Are we good?
That is correct, Annette. It is working. All good. Looks great.
Wonderful. So the main focus is why this COP that's just started in Glasgow matters. But I'll talk a little about some of the components and some of the science that's led us to this point. So just when I can get this to advance. Okay, so where did it start? Well, it actually goes all the way back to 1992 and the Rio Conventions, if you remember those. I think probably we are all old enough to remember that. When I talked to my colleagues at work, some of them weren't even born then. But yes, it was one of the 3 Rio Conventions is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the parties to the convention, known as the COP, the Conference of the Parties, meet usually annually, COVID willing. Each year they get together and they have progressed their development of their policies to tackle this issue of climate change with several key milestones along the way. The first key milestone was the Kyoto Protocol, adopted in 1997, which had 2 commitment periods, and during that period the developed countries had commitments to reduce their emissions, but the developing countries didn't. So the first commitment period of Kyoto was 2008 to 2012, and the second period was 2013 to 2020. And during the subsequent years, there were attempts to negotiate agreements that would bring all countries on board. Some of them fell a bit flat, like the Copenhagen COP in 2009. But finally, when it came to Paris in 2015, they succeeded with this ambition to bring all countries on board. And so that was what was so great about Paris, that unlike the Kyoto Protocol, indeed, all nations are on board, and that they have adopted a very strict temperature limit to limit warming to well below 2 degrees and preferably no more than 1.5 degrees. And they brought in this language about net zero. They said that in order to meet that temperature target, the world would need to reach the position of net zero in the second half of the century. So that's a position where the emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, are balanced by greenhouse gas removals, which is largely carbon sequestration. And they recognized that it was going to be difficult to get all countries on board and taking enough action to get there, but they needed to get them to start. So they have this concept of stock taking and ratcheting. So the general idea is that countries made commitments, and then they have a global stock take every 5 years to see how we're going. And then if things are not looking good, there'll be encouragement for countries to ramp up their ambition. And to bring all countries on board, they needed to be more flexible than they were the first time around in the Kyoto Protocol. So in this case, under the Paris Agreement, the countries actually determine their own targets and they declare these under their nationally determined contributions, known as the NDCs. And the idea here is that it's only fair to allow developing countries to continue to develop, while the developed countries that have much more capacity economically to take action get on with it, because they're the ones that have benefited from having emitted all those fossil fuels in the past. There is a common framework for reporting, although there are some details still to be ironed out there. And there's a mechanism by which the developed countries provide financial assistance to developing countries to take action under the agreement. So along the way, from Paris to now, the IPCC has developed several reports to inform the negotiations of the COP. So they work in assessment cycles, and there have been 3 reports prior to the actual 6th assessment report. So 3 special reports. And the first of these is the special report on warming of 1.5, known as the SR 1.5. It has quite a long title there, but I won't read that out. The objective of the SR 1.5 was to look into the prospects of being able to meet this target of limiting warming to 1.5 and what it would mean to do so. they worked out that it really was worthwhile trying to get to 1.5 or trying to limit warming to 1.5, no more than 1.5, because if it goes higher than that, it will be more difficult, much more difficult for human and natural systems to adapt to that amount of warming. But the challenge is that human activities have already caused, well, at that time, about 1 degree of warming. And so that obviously means that we'd need drastic cuts to the current rate of emissions in order to meet that target. And that it's also likely to require taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, carbon dioxide removals, otherwise known as NETS, negative emissions technologies. So this figure illustrates some of these so-called negative emissions technologies. And some of them are straightforward things like planting trees and building soil carbon that take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere as the trees grow or as the plants grow and turn into soil organic matter. But there are some others that are, I guess, more technological. One of them is BECCS, bioenergy linked to carbon capture and storage. So here you grow biomass, you combust it, you capture the flue gases, and then you condense them and put them underground, geosequestration. So that's a negative technology. There's DAC, the direct air carbon capture technology, which is large fans draw air across a solvent, and they again capture the CO2 and put that underground. Actually, I've just remembered that I've got some more slides after this, so I'll just keep going and come back to the details of how these work as I show you the individual slides. Apologies for being confused. So yes, planting trees, an obvious method. This is the BECCS one, growing the biomass, combusting it, capturing the flue gases and injecting those underground, with the various issues that are associated with CCS and the other issues associated with growing lots of biomass. Then there's the soil carbon sequestration one. This also offers the co-benefits that if you're building soil carbon, you're building soil organic matter, and that's good for productivity, etc. Nutrient retention, reducing erosion and that sort of thing. The next one I've got on my list here is biochar. Now, I'm sure some of you at least have heard me talk about biochar before, and maybe others. If you're not familiar with it, biochar means taking biomass and heating it in a low oxygen environment. So you're not combusting it, you're pyrolyzing it, and you're creating a product that is essentially charcoal. At the same time, it releases combustible syngases, which can be used as an energy product. And then we call it biochar when you use it as a soil amendment. If you haven't heard of this before, you might think that sounds a bit strange, but the reason why we do this is because scientists discovered quite some time back that there are soils in the Amazon that have been enriched with charcoal in this way by indigenous people in past centuries, and they're highly fertile compared with the adjacent soils. It does seem that they did this kind of maybe by accident. It was probably their rubbish dump. They put the charcoal from their fires, their chicken bones and their broken crockery in there. And then this somehow managed to build these very fertile soils. So we're using this approach to see if we make new biochar, new charcoal, and put that into the ground, we get the same benefits in terms of soil fertility. Biochar can be made in a number of different ways at different scales. The images here show anything from a hole in the ground or a cook stove through to a plant that's processing several tonnes per hour. And in fact, that one at the bottom right is Logan City Council is putting in a pyrolysis plant at their wastewater treatment plant, which is pretty exciting. And the answer was yes. We found that when we put biochar into the soil, it does improve soil properties. It can increase water retention, which is very important as a climate change adaptation measure as droughts become more frequent and severe. It has other interesting and useful properties in increasing the cation exchange capacity, and so the nutrient holding capacity of the soil. It can immobilize heavy metals. So if the soil is contaminated with heavy metals, it reduces the uptake by plants. So it makes it easier to grow healthy food in it, even when you have contaminated soil. And that applies also to some of these nasty new organic contaminants like PFAS. Biochar can immobilize that too. And because it increases the nutrient retention and reduces leaching and volatilization, it increases the nutrient use efficiency of the fertilizer you apply. So you might need less fertilizer, which is also good for climate because making fertilizer is a greenhouse intensive process. And there's this interesting phenomenon that we've demonstrated in Wollongbar. We have the longest running field trial in the world with biochar at the Wollongbar Research Station. And near Ballina, if you don't know where that one's. And here we found that having applied the biochar once 10 years ago, the soil carbon levels are continuing to increase over and above the amount of carbon that was in the biochar. We call this negative priming, and it's an interesting interaction between the biochar, the soil minerals, the particular clays that are in this soil, and the organic matter that leaks out of plant roots when there's plants growing there, and the microorganisms in the soil, and they basically bind this together. Having the biochar there binds that organic matter and the minerals together so that the bugs can't get at it and can't eat it. So that's what negative priming is. But in case this all sounds too good to be true, biochars do vary depending on what feedstock you make them from and the temperature of pyrolysis, and the response also varies depending on the soil type and the plant. So you need to choose the right biochar for the right context. So back to this other interesting way of taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere that I called DAC, direct air capture. So as I said, this one was about mounting fans that suck the air across the solvent and then collecting the CO2, condensing that and pumping it underground. The one at the bottom there, enhanced weathering, is a very low-tech solution, really. It's taking basalt and crushing it finely and spreading it across the ground. And basalt naturally weathers and takes CO2 out of the atmosphere as it weathers, but that normally happens very slowly. But if you crush it very finely, you can get it to happen faster. So that's what we mean by enhanced weathering. And then there are these marine-based strategies, some of which I think sound quite peculiar, which would involve taking crop residues or logs out to the ocean and dumping them there and letting them settle on the ocean floor where they don't decompose because there's no oxygen. But I find that rather odd, and I think that there's better things that could be done with that biomass or those logs. There's fertilizing the ocean with iron or nitrogen or phosphorus, because the open ocean is actually quite infertile. And if you fertilize it with these elements, you can get an algal bloom. And if you have algae growing, they take CO2 out of the atmosphere. And so the suggestion is that they would then sink to the bottom. But clearly that could have various ecological implications. The one that is getting most attention at the moment is ocean alkalinization, so making the ocean more alkaline. And if it's more alkaline, then it can absorb more CO2 from the atmosphere. So that's the general idea there. And that could actually be quite important to save the barrier reef, for example, because as the ocean gets more alkaline, it becomes harder and harder for those corals to survive. So there may be an application for that there, but I'm really hoping that we don't need these more dramatic, more technological solutions to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. The modelling that they did to inform the Special Report 1.5, done with their integrated assessment models, is a bit limited in how many of these different types of carbon dioxide removal strategies it can actually model. And so they focused to date largely on tree planting and BECCS, the bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And this figure illustrates a range of scenarios. So they rely on thousands and thousands of different runs with different models under different scenarios. But this illustrates the range of scenarios through from P1, which is a world where we all take action to reduce emissions very fast. And we don't, in that case, need a lot of tree planting and a lot of BECCS, through all the way to the P4 scenario, which is pretty much a business as usual. We continue our fossil fuel intensive lifestyles. And in that case, we need a great deal of BECCS to take that CO2 out of the atmosphere. And they quantified the amount of, or the area of energy crops that you might need to do this. And it went all the way from 20 million hectares through to 720 million hectares, which is in fact equivalent to half the arable land area of the world. So that would be very dramatic if that was necessary in order to survive climate change. And so it was actually a topic that was of quite a lot of concern and interest when we came to write the report on the special report on climate change and land. I was involved in this report in the chapter on land degradation. The key theme of this report is the very close relationship between climate change and the land. We talked about the fact that humans currently exploit more than 70% of the Earth's ice-free surface, and more than a quarter of that is degraded, mostly through unsustainable agricultural activities, but also urbanisation, etc. The land is definitely under pressure as a result of that, but climate change is making it much worse. The soil is being lost up to 100 times faster than it's being formed, and with climate change, we're expecting increasingly frequent droughts, which leave the land bare and prone to erosion. But the very close relationship between the land and the climate means that if we manage the land sustainably, we have a win-win. So if we increase soil organic matter, we can increase the productivity of the land and at the same time take CO2 out of the atmosphere and, as I say, provide that win-win. The special report on climate and land identified a range of different sustainable land management strategies, ways to build soil carbon in grasslands and cropping lands, options with agroforestry and forest management, etc., and looked into the potential of those strategies to also deliver co-benefits for climate change adaptation, managing land degradation, and improving food security. I'm not expecting you to read all the details in this slide, but the important thing is that blue is good. And on the whole, those different sustainable land management strategies not only deliver climate change mitigation, but they're also positive for that range of different other objectives. But on the other hand, I also identified that the strategies of afforestation, planting new trees in a place that hasn't naturally had trees, bioenergy, growing energy crops just for the energy or also to do BECCS, do the carbon capture and storage, and biochar are three strategies that do have risks. The main risks there is that if you want to do this so much that you displace agriculture, this obviously would be a problem for food security. On the other hand, you might displace natural ecosystems, which would be a problem for biodiversity and ecosystem functions. So the message was that if you're undertaking these strategies, you need to do it with care, in the right place, with the right management practices and at the right scale in order to deliver synergies. There was a third report, special report in this cycle. That's the report on ocean and cryosphere. This report focused on the evidence for impacts on the high mountains, the glaciers, the polar ice, on sea level rise, and as I say, it presented the evidence for change, and it also looked at the impacts of ongoing climate change in those environments and opportunities for management. But the most important report in the sixth assessment cycle is the sixth assessment report. And as Helen mentioned, the first part of the report was released just a couple of months ago, back in August. And so that's part one. I'm not actually an author on part one. I'm an author on part three, the Working Group 3 report on mitigation. And that report will be coming out in March next year, we hope. But anyway, I did have some involvement in reviewing, for example, this Working Group 1 report, and we have some joint work on the nerdy topic of climate metrics. I'm sure you saw the media attention when the sixth assessment report came out. It shouldn't be a surprise. We're all thoroughly aware, I think, that the evidence of climate change is all around us. There's no ignoring it, especially in Australia over these last couple of years. What the report said was that human activities have indeed warmed the planet to more than 1 degree on average, and it's actually 1.4 degrees over Australia. Each of the past 4 decades has been the warmest since pre-industrial times sequentially. Probably the worst news is that there's an over 50% chance that we'll cross that threshold of 1.5 degrees warming in the 2030s. So clearly, unless there is immediate, rapid and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, it seems that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is going to be beyond reach, which is, of course, a very sad message. The report did say, though, that it's not quite too late. If we do succeed in bringing about rapid reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and meeting that net zero point around 2050, we could definitely keep it below 2 degrees. And we could probably come back to 2 degrees after an overshoot. So one of the factors that the report was stressing was the very close relationship between the amount of CO2 emitted and the temperature increase. What this means is that because of this close linear relationship, the most important mitigation strategy is to not emit CO2 in the first place. And the next most important thing to do is to take it back out of the atmosphere. So managing CO2 emissions, limiting the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is absolutely the most important strategy to control climate change. You may have heard quite a bit of attention to this issue of the remaining carbon budget and what this means in terms of how many years we have left before we cross this threshold. I did talk about the fact that the report says that we could cross that 1.5 degree threshold in the 2030s, but the report doesn't actually say, and therefore we only have 8, 9, 10 years left or whatever it is. The people that are expressing it that way are actually misconstruing this table. This table does have some numbers in it. This 900 here, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, hopefully you can, is interpreted as meaning we only have 8, 9 years left. But what this table is actually saying is that there's actually quite a large uncertainty about calculating this remaining carbon budget because of the uncertainties in the relationship between emissions and climate change itself, but also because the amount of carbon dioxide we have room for in the atmosphere before we cross a threshold is also strongly dependent on the amount of non-CO2 greenhouse gases, in particular methane, that we have in the atmosphere at the same time. So it's not so simple to be able to say there's this many years left. I suggest you avoid expressing it in that type of way, but certainly it's urgent to take action. This is the type of illustration that the IPCC shows to talk about how we need to get to this net zero target. So, excuse me, check. This shows a pathway in which we expect emissions will continue to rise for another at least few years, and then they'll reach a peak, and then all our efforts to reduce emissions will become more obvious, and the rate of emissions will decrease. We'll also ramp up the strategies for taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and so the combination of those strategies will allow us to get to net zero at a global level, and then go below that, in fact, to get to net negative, and then at that point the world would start to cool. So if we do have a situation of an overshoot where we go beyond the amount of CO2 that's consistent with the 1.5 degree target, it's not an enormous calamity. The expectation is that we would be able to come back from that position through carbon dioxide removal. The report includes for the first time a section on regional trends, and this is what it says for Australia. Basically more bad news, more of the types of climate disasters that we've been seeing over the last couple of years. So more droughts, more cyclones, more storms, more dust storms, more bushfires. It shouldn't be a surprise. That's what the scientists said would happen with climate change. Obviously, this is really bad for the primary industries of Australia. And it's worse for Australia than it is for other countries that don't have such a variable climate in the first place as the baseline. The report has a table that shows the temperature trajectory under a range of different climate scenarios. And this slide is actually put together by the Climate Council. So they took the table out of the special report, out of the Working Group 1 sixth assessment report, and they put a few pointers on there to show us where we're heading at the moment. And the answer is that under the current national pledges, those nationally determined contributions, if you add them up across the world, we're heading for an increase of about 2.7 degrees. Unfortunately, the current policies of the countries of the world don't actually meet their pledges. So under the current policies, we're heading for 3.6 degrees. If we don't manage to constrain it there and we've actually followed the worst case scenario that's modeled, we might get up to 4.4 degrees, and that's a point at which we would be, it would be likely that we'd be tripping the tipping points and reaching a point where we have irreversible changes in some of our landscapes and ecosystems. So the countries of the world have been paying attention lately. They have been concerned, they were increasingly concerned about the impacts of climate change, and particularly after the sixth assessment report came out, have galvanised their action towards this goal of net zero. As I explained, it's a point at which the emissions are balanced by the removals, carbon sequestration. So many countries have pledged to take on net zero targets. We were certainly a laggard there. This map, the different shades of green and brown show different levels of commitment of the net zero targets, and the greys are the countries that have no target at all. So Australia has just snuck onto this map just in time for the COP. So now let's talk about what's actually going to be happening at the COP. There are a series of themes that have been negotiated. So when the world leaders turn up at the COP, they're actually accompanied by a whole lot of bureaucrats and scientific advisors who have been in negotiation all the while since the previous COP. They have a series of meetings through the year. And then when they get together at the COP, it's a 2-week meeting. The first week is the more bureaucratic part, and the second week is the high level segment where the world leaders come in and they make the pledges and agree to the final positions that have been negotiated during the 2 weeks. So these are the themes that will be the basis for the negotiations. As I say, they're kind of ongoing themes. Many of the points were commenced in Paris, and they've been ironing out the details as they've met each year since Paris. So there's the theme on mitigation, trying to ramp up the ambition, but there's also themes on adaptation, how they will finance the impacts of loss and damage, and building the carbon markets. This is a figure that comes out of Australia's new net zero plan, the Australian way to get to net zero. And I've included that because it's a general illustration of the fact that we're not actually heading to the target we need to be heading if you combine all the countries' commitments. And in order to get there, we really do need very sharp declines. This image by our leaders in Canberra has also been designed, I guess, to show Australia's very small contribution to this goal. Australia is in the dark blue here, and it's showing the important scale of emissions from some other countries around the world, China and the US and Europe, for example. So that, I guess, is the most important thing that we hope will happen at COP26. That is that, having recognised that we're not quite on the way to meeting that target, countries will ramp up their ambition. So that's why there was a lot of pressure on Australia to say something about a 2030 target, because many other countries have agreed to increase their ambition, increase their targets for 2030, or bring forward their targets for when they would reach net zero. A second point that they're discussing this week in Glasgow is about climate finance. in Paris, they calculated and agreed that they would try to round up 100 billion US to support the developing countries. This was what was promised, but it hasn't been delivered. And so there's a lot of pressure on developing countries to actually make good on those promises. The third one is about refining the Paris rule book. So this is the rules under which the countries will do their reporting on against their own commitments, but they need to use this common reporting format. And so there's some niceties in the rules about this that have not yet been finalised. So we really hope that will happen this time. They thought that would happen in Madrid, but they didn't quite get there. One of the sticking points is on emissions trading. That's the so-called Article 6 negotiations. And apparently Australia's been one of the laggards there too, which is a bit disappointing in making it difficult to reach this, to finalise the rules on emissions trading. No doubt you're sick of hearing the meet and beat claim from our leaders, just as I am, because we had a pretty slack commitment in the first place. And yes, we did manage to meet it, but one of the ways we met it was by stopping land clearing. And so we've got some spare credits from land clearing. So we want to be able to claim those against our Paris Agreement targets, and the rest of the world thinks that's not really very fair and not in keeping with the spirit of the agreement. But we're still arguing on that one, apparently. And then lastly, there's that point about finding a way to fund the terrible problem of loss and damage that is causing catastrophe, I guess, for developing countries as climate change is having an impact. So we have the Green Climate Fund at the moment, which developed countries pay funds into that, the GCF, and also into the GEF, the Global Environment Facility, and that's used to fund actions for the developing countries. But it's about projects to reduce emissions, but doesn't fund this, cover them for the losses. So that's what we're looking to do this time. There's some other things that are happening or even happened already that you should watch out for from this Glasgow COP. Boris Johnson has a list of things that he's trying to achieve, and some of them are really happening already. So on the first day of COP, we had the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forest and Land Use. And so that was a declaration where the countries have said that they will aim to stop deforestation by 2030. So that's wonderful, and Australia has signed on to that one. Then there was the Glasgow Breakthrough Agenda, which is an agreement to collaborate and assist developing countries with clean tech development and deployment. The third one is one that's been in the news a bit for us, and that was the Global Methane Pledge, which is something that the US and the EU have been working on in the lead up to COP. And the idea is there that countries would agree to a pledge to reduce their methane levels by 30% by 2030. And apparently over 100 countries have already signed up to that. But unfortunately, Australia is not one of those. We've been joined by, I believe it's China, Russia, India, and Iran in rejecting that one. There's a bunch of reasons, I imagine, which we could discuss maybe later. The next thing that Boris was very keen on is his Powering Past Coal Alliance. He was really hoping to make inroads into this concept of getting countries to sign on to phase out coal. Now, I was really busy, but I did hear something quick this evening, which sounded like they might have done something today in trying to raise the profile of this ambition. But I can't imagine Australia is going to be signing on to that one, unfortunately. There are a couple of other phrases that you might hear a lot. The first one is just transitions, which is an expression identifying that developing countries need to have flexibility and need to have the capacity to develop so that they can reach the level of lifestyle that we enjoy, and that the developed countries need to support them in order to get there, but that they may be able to avoid making some of the mistakes that we've made. So if they can leapfrog the dirty fossil fuel phase and go straight into clean renewables, then that's really wonderful, and that's what what some of these alliances are trying to achieve. So, for example, the Powering Past Coal Alliance announced that they're working with South Africa in order to help them in this endeavour of just transitions. And the last one I've got there is nature-based solutions. A lot of people are pretty excited about the prospects of using land restoration, reforestation in particular, ecological restoration to sequester carbon at the same time deliver biodiversity benefits and restore ecosystems and ecosystem functions. So there's a lot of attention to the benefits, the co-benefits of nature-based solutions and trying to aim finance in that direction. But there is a bit of tension there too, though, because carbon sequestered in trees or in soil or in wetlands is vulnerable to future loss, whereas carbon sequestered deep underground is apparently very safe. And so, yeah, there's, as I say, a bit of tension there about the vulnerability of those two different approaches.
Annette, can we just answer a couple of questions that have come up?
Yep, sure.
Liz O'Hara has asked, do our emissions include stage 3 emissions?
Scope 3 emissions, I think. No, they don't. When we do accounting and reporting under the UNFCCC, our reporting boundary is our territorial boundary. So the edge of Australia is as far as we count. Whereas if we were counting scope 3 emissions, that would mean that we're counting the emissions that are incurred in Japan when we export coal to Japan and they burn it there. So no, under the UNFCCC rules, Japan reports those emissions and Australia only reports the emissions associated with digging up the coal and getting it to the port. When it comes to companies making pledges, a lot of them are making pledges to offset their scope 3 emissions or to reduce their scope 3 emissions. And clearly, when everybody's trying to reduce their own direct emissions plus their scope 3 emissions, we're going to have a whole lot better chance of getting to net zero, because that will mean those things are not sort of forgotten and left out if we don't have everybody on board. So perhaps if China has said that they're not going to get to net zero as fast as some other countries, but if as an exporting nation we cared about our scope 3 emissions when they turned up in China, then that wouldn't actually matter that they had a target that was further in the future.
Thanks for that. A question from Dorothy Robinson while we're at it. Are you optimistic about the Meat and Livestock Association achieving carbon neutrality by 2030?
Yeah. Well, yes. Meat and Livestock Australia, the Red Meat Association, Industry Association of Australia, has adopted this quite ambitious target of carbon neutrality by 2030. When they did that, I was quite surprised. But it turns out that they had some inside information about this amazing effectiveness of the red seaweed, the Asparagopsis, in reducing emissions from ruminant animals. So if you feed a small percentage of Asparagopsis, it can reduce methane emissions by up to 90%, which is astounding, really. There's also 3-NOP, a chemical additive that also is quite effective in reducing emissions from livestock. So if it weren't for that, I would think it was a totally impossible, Dorothy. But because 3-NOP and Asparagopsis seem very effective, and they do at the moment need to be fed daily, so they're really only suitable for use in feedlots or in dairies, but they're working very hard on formulations that would be suitable for giving to grazing livestock. And also the CN30 target is not just about reducing methane emissions from the animals, it's about taking other action to sequester carbon, etc. So managing your grazing better so that you can build soil carbon, for example, working with animal genetics, which you're thoroughly familiar with, and herd management approaches to make sure your animals are healthy and growing as fast as they can, that type of thing, are all different ways to be able to reduce the emissions of the red meat product, I suppose. So I guess I don't know that 2030 is going to be met, but I certainly think they're going to they have quite some good prospects in reducing their emissions and contributing to the net zero target by 2050. Yeah.
Just one more question before we move on from Helen. We've heard a lot about extensive land clearing over recent years. Are you confident that the statistics are correct that massive land clearing has stopped or slowed?
Well, Australia was clearing land at a very high rate in the 1990s, and particularly in Queensland. And they brought in controls on land clearing, which did have a dramatic impact in Queensland and New South Wales in particular, in reducing emissions. And they certainly lowered the rate of land clearing quite dramatically. After a change in government and change in policies in New South Wales, the land clearing rate has actually gone up a bit. I'm interested that we signed on to the Stop Deforestation by 2030 pledge, because I'm not quite sure how they're going to do that. I guess maybe that's net deforestation, because I'm assuming that there will still be opportunities for landholders to clear land and for urban development and all those sorts of things, roads and railways and things. But I'm imagining that there'll be some sort of ramping up of the biodiversity offset schemes that we have at the moment anyway, so that land clearing is, at least in theory, only allowed when you take action to make up for it elsewhere in the landscape. So yeah.
Thanks.
That's all
you can proceed.
Thank you. Okay, so now I've got a slide put together by the Climate Council, which I stole from them, which I thought was quite informative. It was about where Australia is going to potentially hear from the others that they're not exactly pleased with the efforts that we're making. I talked about the fact that the countries will be expecting to ramp up their ambition in terms of mitigation, but we have declined to do that, unfortunately. There is another phase, or another component, stream of the negotiations is about adaptation. I don't actually know very much about that, but I gather that there's a report that's being put together and that's going to be coming out in the next year. So I'm looking forward to seeing that. Then there's this effort on mobilising the finance that I mentioned, and Australia here is a laggard as well, which is again very unfortunate and embarrassing. And finally, there's this intention from Boris Johnson to really make great progress towards phasing out coal. And of course, it's a bit unlikely that we're going to be signing up to that one. So there'll be pressure on that from that direction as well. This is another one from the Climate Council showing how some countries have really ramped up their ambition, the UK in particular. So blue is their original pledges and yellow is their second pledges coming up to this, this COP, which was the time at which they should have been reviewing and renewing their pledges. In fact, it was last year, but of course the COP was delayed. So yeah, but we haven't come on board with that. You're probably familiar with this very useful website, the Climate Action Tracker, which does a report card on all countries with respect to how they're going to contribute to the global goal of net zero, what their current policies are doing, how they're going with actually meeting those pledges. This was, in all fairness, I have to tell you that this was dated back in September, so they haven't actually updated it yet since we did make that net zero pledge. So presumably we'll get a slightly better scorecard the next time they review that. But yeah, definitely Australia is not stepping up, not shouldering its fair share of the burden in reaching this net zero goal. As I said, you've no doubt sick of them. Australia will meet and beat its commitments. The only reason why our emissions have actually gone down is because of reducing the rate of land clearing. So that's that minus 109% over there on the right. Our emissions have actually gone up in the fossil fuel sector, so electricity, stationary energy, transport, the fugitive emissions, that's the methane that leaks out of the pipelines, for example, gas pipelines, and industrial processes. There has been a decrease in agricultural emissions. Partly that's because they're quite variable, depending on whether we've had a drought or not. And if we've just been through a phase of drought, we have less animals. So they're likely actually to come back up again in the next year or so. We've had a really good season this year, so we're likely to see the emissions actually going up instead. But this is what Australia has pledged to do. We have the Australian way of getting to net zero. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the details of this new policy that was just announced a week ago, I guess. There's 2 documents online. There's the short version, the one called the Australian Way, and then there's the long version, the long-term emissions reduction plan. So just a few figures from that just to close up here so that you're in the picture of what it is that our Prime Minister has declared they will achieve. It's all about technology, not taxes. Well, that's rather technology and taxes on ordinary people to pay for the fact that we're not going to tax the heavy emitters, because we're relying very much on the measures that are in the technology investment roadmap, which was announced some time back, which is largely about carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, etc. And there's a small amount that's about trying to do carbon sequestration, and that's pretty much all focused on soil carbon, which is interesting. I'm a soil scientist, so I quite like the fact that they're paying attention to soil carbon, but let's get back to that in a moment. So as I said, the emphasis is on technology. There's an expectation of really large reductions in the electricity sector, so an expectation that we will have a ramping up of renewables, but also that we will ramp up carbon capture and storage so that we can continue to burn fossil fuels with no emissions, apparently. In the transport sector, a move to electric vehicles is expected to make big decreases there. In the building sector, there's measures about low emissions cement, things you can put into it, mineral carbonation, for example, to increase the CO2 out of the atmosphere stored in cement. That's an interesting one. Again, linking to carbon capture and storage to make low emissions steel, for example. And then in the livestock sector, they're not being quite so ambitious as the MLA, interestingly. Maybe that's being realistic, because not only do the cattle and sheep emit methane, which is a bit challenging to address in the grazing situation, but we also have nitrous oxide emitted from agriculture. It's a very powerful greenhouse gas, nearly 300 times worse than CO2. And it's emitted naturally from nitrogen fertilizers or legumes, and there's not much you can do about that. And finally, there we have the sequestration part of the equation. So quite a big reliance on soil carbon, but a very large reliance on carbon capture and storage. And this is actually my last slide. So this is showing some of the details which I found disturbing, actually, most of these, but in particular the top line. So we've been hearing about hydrogen. Well, I've been hearing about hydrogen for decades. Hydrogen has always been the next biggest thing just around the corner, but we seem to be actually turning that corner now, and hydrogen is very much on our agenda and also on the agenda of many countries around the world, Germany and Japan in particular. Now, we've got clean hydrogen written into our plan. They haven't actually defined clean hydrogen in the plan. If you look at the hydrogen strategy, which is behind the plan, you find that there's 2 things under the category of clean hydrogen. One is green hydrogen, which means hydrogen made from electrolysis of water, which probably means a lot of solar panels to do desalination to make fresh water so that we can do electrolysis with a lot more solar panels. So it's a big use of renewable energy, which we could probably use for something else. But at least then you've got green hydrogen. However, this plan is about blue hydrogen, and blue hydrogen means hydrogen made from fossil fuels, where you just capture the CO2 and you do CCS. And what they're planning is for Australia to ramp up its hydrogen market and become a world exporter of hydrogen. So what they're actually suggesting is that we will basically mop up the emissions for the rest of the world. So there won't be scope 3 emissions associated with our hydrogen, because we will make blue hydrogen that we'll call clean hydrogen, because we'll sequester all this carbon by CCS, and then we'll be exporting clean hydrogen for the rest of the world. So I'm quite bothered about that. The other measures here seem to have virtue. Ultra low cost solar, apparently they don't know how they're going to do it, they're just hoping. Measures for energy storage, of course, are useful. Low emissions steel is about using hydrogen to do that, but they could be using biomass, which is another way to make low emissions steel. Ditto for the aluminium. And then there's the carbon capture and storage, which I've discussed already. Finally, at the bottom, we have soil carbon. Now, you may have heard a bit of noise in the press this week from a few people saying that this is a bit unrealistic, and certainly they do seem to be a bit ambitious in the rate of soil carbon sequestration that they're suggesting could be achieved. But on the other hand, building soil carbon is, as I've said, a good thing to do. Building soil organic matter for productivity and resilience of our landscapes. So I'm quite pleased that there's going to be funding for efforts to for research into how we build soil carbon and for how we measure it and model it. So to me, that's one small bright point in this plan. And that is the end of what I was going to say. I was thinking that if we have time now, we could have a discussion about various things, which might include what's happening in New South Wales and what's happening in Armidale even, because I didn't really have time to put together slides on any of those things, but I thought we could talk about them. Thanks, Ian or Helen.
Helen? Is Helen in the building? Thanks, Annette. That was fantastic. Oh, great.
Yeah. Yes, thanks very much, Annette. That was just a really wonderful summary of what's been happening and highlighting, I guess, changes that I certainly hadn't got my head around yet. So it's just really great to have your slides and your perspectives on that. Yeah, I guess what it shows is that we still have a long way to go, but it's good to see that there's some progress being made. And I think it's good to see that you're enthusiastic about some of the carbon sequestration ideas. So thank you very much. Perhaps Ian might help us have a look at what questions might be up and go through those. Thank you.
As I've sort of grasped the last question there, maybe I could talk a bit about that you know, we've only got 8 or 9 years left issue. And the point is that, yes, we do need to take rapid action. We do need to stop burning fossil fuels. We do need to stop putting CO2 into the atmosphere, but we also need to plan how we do that sensibly. So if you took this route very strictly, then you might say, well, we shouldn't build a railway line because we'll incur emissions in concrete, steel and aluminium. And so it could put us off from making sensible decisions. What we need to do is look at the short, medium and longer term impact of the decisions we make today. So stopping building a new coal-fired power station is absolutely the most important thing to do. Turning them off sooner is also important. But we, I guess, need to recognise that we are going to have to invest greenhouse gases in the technologies that will allow us to get to net zero in the medium term and to maybe get net negative in the longer term.
I've gone to gallery view, everybody. I think with the amount of people here, I think we can just open it up and fire and ask your questions. I think, Annette, do you want to kick things off with something that you noticed in?
I haven't read many of the others yet.
Oh, there's 2 Annettes.
Yeah, it's the other Annette.
Oh, sorry,
I think.
probably.
The other one.
Annette Cowie. Unmute.
Well, okay, I think you read my last question, which was about the 8 to 9 years part. And I was asking about the science there, because you made a point at the very beginning about that the science had been misinterpreted in terms of that we only have 8 or 9 years.
Mm.
And I guess my question that's written in the chat there is around, what are you saying there about the science? Your answer that you gave then was around, let's think about it. I agree about the investment in terms of a railway or whatever. I still would reiterate that question though. Why did you want to draw attention at the beginning of the talk to the incorrectness of the way in which that? Are you saying the people that say we've only got 8 or 9 years are misinterpreting the potential that we've got in terms of what the science is saying?
Well,
at the same time, there is this, and then I think the second half of the question is around, that target of the 2030. Don't you, and this is like a where science and policy and politics comes together, like, don't you think that there's an urgency around action towards a target of 2030? And so, yeah, we might make mistakes, but wouldn't it be better to make mistakes that are wrong rather than keep going along the pathway that we're on or something? I mean, I think that's, so I don't know if you understand what I'm saying. I'm a little bit three-pronged.
I think so. Yeah, well, it's basically that point that it's misrepresenting the science to say that the IPCC says there's 8 or 9 years left, because the IPCC doesn't actually say that. The IPCC says that we need to have a strategy that allows us to get to net zero by around 2050. So that's the point that we need to be at. And they say that there's many ways to get there. Some of them could be kind of straight down from where we are now at a slower trajectory, and some of them are keeping going up and then coming down really fast. And they, as long as they get to that point of net zero around 2050 to 2060, we get to meet that target, the 1.5 degree target. So, so that's what I'm saying about it being misrepresenting the science to say that the science says that it's only 8 to 9 years. And then there's that other aspect about the uncertainty about that number, that 8 to 9 years is a calculation based on the smallest estimate of the carbon budget, completely ignoring the fact that it is actually a very wide range in that table that I showed.
All right. Well, I'll just ask my other question that I put in the chat, because so let me put it a different way and in a different topic. So with respect to the stop deforestation by 2030 and that agreement that's happened at the COP just recently, I understand from this sort of stuff that I've read that inside the language of that, deforestation is not, something like native, sustainable, native land, native tree use is not considered deforestation. That's because right. The way in which the language is done is that that's sustainable, therefore it's not deforestation. So I know this is not your, but in terms of linguistics and whatnot and where you sit, would you make a general comment on the slipperiness of language and the way that it keeps changing around these sorts of things? And this, I guess, yeah.
Yeah. Well, deforestation is a word that is, I'm actually absolutely into the definitions. I'm part of the glossary group on the AR6. I mean, that's one of my parts of the sixth assessment report, even in the first volume. So yes, I'm really into these words, and deforestation is the word we use for land use change when you start with a forest and you end up with something else. If you start with a forest and you cut some trees down and you replant the forest, then that's not deforestation, that's using a forest, that's forestry. It's like using land to grow a crop. The land is managed for tree production if it's a managed forest as a production forest. So that's why it's not deforestation, because it's not converting from forest land cover to urban or agriculture, for example. So it might be a bit surprising, but that's how it works. So you can come in, you can do clear fell of a plantation, and the next day there will be no trees there. But as long as it is replanted within, I think it's 2 years, it'll be counted as land that's remaining forest.
Thanks.
Can I ask about Armidale in a couple of sentences when you mentioned that you could talk about what's happening here?
Yeah, maybe I would just go back up to New South Wales for a sec. So New South Wales has been far ahead of our Commonwealth brothers and sisters. In fact, all the states have a net zero target and have had for a while, 2050 or sooner. So New South Wales has a net zero 2050 target. We had an ambition to reduce by 35% by 2030, and now we've put that up to 50. So that's great news. And because we have that statewide target, there's a number of different programs with local government to help them to reach net zero at their own local government areas, mostly focused on the greater Sydney, Wollongong, Newcastle sort of area at the moment. But yes, I'm hoping that will come to the bush as well. But we also have, and one thing, this is actually happening at the federal level. So at the federal level, we have the emissions reduction fund. So this is the mechanism by which we take taxpayers' money and we give it to landholders mostly to do actions that reduce emissions or sequester carbon. And then, so the taxpayers buy it, and that's part of our commitment under Kyoto or now under Paris. But that process can also be used to create offset credits. So those offset credits can be sold to offset emissions under the climate active scheme. So that's what's happening in Armidale. The climate active scheme allows entities like organizations or to get carbon neutral certification for products, or at the organization level or at the precinct level, or what else? Events even, or building. And so Armidale is, well, the council and the uni are working together to prepare to apply for carbon neutral certification for Armidale. So Cara Tai is busily working away on quantifying the baseline so that we can work out what the emissions of our area are, and then we can work out what how we could reduce them, and then how much we'd have to buy or create somehow offsets in order to offset the emissions that we can't avoid. Yeah.
So Annette, on that, so that's the Project 030 project you're talking about, and that started in 2019. But I might have this wrong, but I thought that the allocation of Armidale as a renewable energy zone happened after that.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, I don't know if anyway, I'm wondering the extent to which that's been considered or taken on board in terms of understanding what it is we're doing as a community. So there is a carbon offset component, but at the other side, there's we want zero emissions, not just through carbon offsets. Like, that's one way of skinning a cat, but I don't think that's the only way. And then if we have this renewable energy zone where we end up with all of this renewable energy, we could effectively do nothing. We could, on that scheme, on the accounting scheme, we could, I wouldn't say it would be the right way to go about it, but you could, on an accounting framework, go, oh well, we've taken care of it. We've got all this renewable energy. We don't need to do anything else. So I'm
not so bothered about that. Like, if we have renewable energy as a way to get to carbon neutral, that's so much better than if we continue to burn fossil fuels and buy offsets, for example, from wind farms in India or something, because doing that really does mean that we're not taking any action whatsoever. So offsetting all your emissions is definitely a bad way to go, and it's not actually allowed under the rules. Under the rules, you can't get certification unless you can demonstrate that you have a feasible, a plausible strategy to reduce your emissions so that you can demonstrate that you're actually serious. But yep, I agree with you that if we have renewable energy, that might mean that we don't have to take other action, but that we need a portfolio. We need to have renewable energy. We really need to stop using fossil fuels for energy. One thing we need to remember too, though, in our region, a large amount of the emissions, and I don't know yet because Cara hasn't done the sums, or she has, I haven't seen them yet. We have a whole lot of sheep. Now, we have those sheep in our region, but they're not necessarily consumed by our region. In fact, most of them aren't. The produce of those sheep, the meat and the wool, is actually supporting a wider region of the world. So we're incurring emissions for the rest of the population. And that might mean it seems a bit unfair that we have to offset or whatever, do something about to counteract those emissions, even though we're incurring those emissions for someone else. And this is a topic that we haven't really discussed yet, I don't think. And at the state level, we've sort of had a vague discussion, but we haven't really got there. It's along the lines of, well, is it okay to offset emissions by buying credits in some other country, or do we have to actually take all our action within our own boundary? And so at the state level, I think it's likely that we're going to have a policy that says, yeah, if you want offsets, then it's carbon sequestration actions that happen within New South Wales that you'll be supporting financially. But I don't know how that's going to work quite in our Armidale region, because I don't really think that our community has the capacity or should actually have to fund offsetting the emissions from all of the livestock in our region. But it's a discussion we really need to have.
Thank you.
Dorothy's been very patient here.
Dorothy did have a question. Are you there, Dorothy?
Yeah, well, I had a couple of questions, and first of all, just add a comment. When we're talking about the 8 or 9 years on the carbon budget, as I remember you saying, it was 1.5 degrees. There's a 50% chance by 2035, and I think that's another key scientific fact that we've also got to take account of. That it's not just so if we exceed 1.5 degrees by 2035, which is a 50% chance, then it will be very, very difficult to get back. And so that is something that we should be considering is urgent. I don't know if anybody else has any comments on that, or I could ask my other question first, and which was just basically, Annette also mentioned that the accounting procedures were also under review. And I'm wondering whether there's any chance sooner or later of adding important greenhouse substances like carbon monoxide and black carbon, because I know it will be very, very difficult because of the variability in their emissions factors, or the GWP, over the different regions. But there are now estimates out there in the IPCC AR5, and maybe it's time we started thinking about it. That was all I wanted to say. Thanks.
Yeah. In relation to the short-lived climate forces, the black carbon and that sort of thing, there's an ongoing sort of low-level discussion about recognizing that it's important, recognizing that it's difficult, because the only good thing about CO2, methane and nitrous oxide is that they are well mixed greenhouse gases, so the emission anywhere on the planet has the same effect on the world. So it makes the accounting really simple, and whereas that's not the case when it comes to something like black carbon. So I don't have a good answer to that, other than that there's this ongoing group that's having discussions and written a report, which doesn't say much yet, about how you might bring the short-lived climate forces into the calculations for the commitments under the UNFCCC, but I'm not seeing it having any effect in the near future. The other problem is that there's enormous inertia, because it takes a huge amount of negotiation and therefore a huge amount of time to bring all the countries to agree to anything. So it was a huge effort in the first place to come up with a metric to add all the greenhouse gases together that are counted in the so-called Kyoto basket of gases. So changing that is absolutely turning an enormous ship around, to think that they'll shift on that. But they're recognizing that it's an issue, that the global warming potential 100 that we use currently is not perfect. But on the other hand, there's part of the sixth assessment report that I have been involved in writing that points to the fact that the global warming potential 100 is consistent with least cost efforts to get to the net zero target. So it's considered to be worthwhile and useful from that perspective.
But they're now also adding the methane target, which is good.
Yes. Yeah, targeting methane separately is actually a much more sensible way to deal with it than to try and find a metric that combines them both, because they're such different gases with such different behaviors in the atmosphere, as you're thoroughly aware. So having separate target made sense. And that's what New Zealand did. They came out and said we had, they had a target for everything, but then they had their methane target separately from their other greenhouse gases. Recognizing that. Was that everything you asked, Dorothy? I can't remember. Was there something at the beginning that I've missed?
That'll do for now, thanks.
So I've got a question there, and Annette, which is, in an ideal world, what would you like to see Armidale doing to play its part in the shift towards zero emissions and towards adaptation?
I think the most important thing we can do is build better houses or fix the houses we've got, because most Armidale houses are really leaky and it's just very stupid. It took me 6 months to not find a house to buy when we moved up to Armidale. I gave up and we built one instead. Yeah, that's just a sad waste of our energy resources, the way we.
So what about transition from fossil fuel based energy to renewable energy in comparison to that energy efficiency of housing?
Obviously really important, but that's, I guess, a thing that I think is happening at state level is, I mean, Matt Keane, he's really gung-ho for renewables. He's doing his darndest to get these renewable energy zones in there to support renewable energy in the state. So I have a lot of confidence that we're going to have, pretty rapid scale up of the renewables, and our grid is going to dramatically reduce in its greenhouse gas intensity, so we can be much more confident in using electric appliances. So that'll be a good thing. And so a combination of lower greenhouse intensity grid, having solar panels on our roofs, and having better designed houses, I think will dramatically reduce our individual footprints of our households in Armidale.
So do you see that there may be a missed opportunity unless the community and 030 and council and they're all really mobilised to seek allocation of the renewable energies that have been produced through the renewable energy zone to within Armidale region, rather than going outside and being allocated elsewhere, like, for example, the ACT with Sapphire Wind?
Yeah, I don't know. I think there's such a momentum for renewables there's going to be a whole lot of it. It's the coal-fired power stations are going to get turned off. We're all going to be doing renewables. At least I certainly hope so. So I think I'm supportive of whatever initiatives are generating renewable energy in Australia that means that coal-fired power gets turned off sooner, and hopefully we don't build new gas-fired power stations. So I'm not really that bothered who takes it up. It's going to be a little tricky if it means that we have problems meeting our net zero target, our carbon neutrality goal, because we can't access renewable energy that's generated in our own region or something. That would be a bit unfortunate, but I'm hoping there'll be opportunities to tap into the green on the grid and that sort of thing. And yep, Annette?
Yeah, no, just so this is really about like what I reflect on as a real contradiction in this whole story and so on. So we end up, you know, in a great world where we have so much renewable energy, we don't know what to do with. It's just coming out of our ears. So does that mean that, you know, we don't need to turn off the lights? We can play the music as loud as we want. We don't have to worry about the heating. Isn't there like a kind of a contradiction in this whole sort of picture around, if you thought of energy like water, oh, well, we've got so much, we don't have to worry about it, you know.
Yep, you're perfectly right. It's the phenomenon that they call rebound.
Right,
and they said
I don't know the answer, but I do know that I feel there's a conflict. I feel like that, whoa, like so if the energy was used for manufacturing in some way for good industry around our local place, great. But if it's just created and used so that we've got so much, we've got to pump it out everywhere, and all the, you know, technology that might be involved in terms of metals to make more and more and more stuff, aren't we in the same problem? So yeah.
Yeah, we need to use our resources efficiently and wisely, whether they're renewable resources or not. I think so, but I agree that that's a challenge. I mean, that seems to be the message, that when people get solar hot water, they don't feel so bad about having long showers, and if they've, you know, driving on electric vehicles, then they think nothing of driving twice as far as they did before, and that sort of thing. So yep, it's not good news, but it's human nature or something. And so when the economists do calculations of the effectiveness of different strategies, they actually take that rebound into consideration, because it also shifts prices. And then when you shift prices, like if it actually puts the price of petrol down because we've got more capacity for other ways of transport, when we have electric vehicles, etc., then people will want to drive further because the petrol's cheaper. And yeah, it's complex to model it, but that's what they do. Anyway, Dorothy, you had another question?
Well, I had one comment, which was that a couple of days ago, myself and Councillor O'Connor met with Dan Boyce, the Chief Officer for Sustainable Development, and we discussed the fact that ARC has agreed to put in a submission on the National Construction Code on energy efficiency of buildings, and that submissions are due by midnight on Sunday. So if anybody's interested, I'll send it to Ian in case I don't get it around in the 5 minutes, the web address of where you submit this, find out more about it. And the other question I had was, you know, are there any pledges of Glasgow on fossil fuels and not promoting the fossil fuel industry? Thanks.
Well, Boris was very keen, apparently, to get a pledge on phasing out coal, but there's obviously quite a bit of opposition from some other countries like ours. I caught something on the news as I walked past the TV this evening, which sounded like they were trying, but I didn't actually hear what the gist of the story was. So I'm hoping that there's good news, but there's, I guess, reasonable pessimism that would actually come out of this COP, partly because there have been some pledges to stop funding new fossil fuel power stations in development projects. So that's good. But it doesn't seem like China's going to stop anytime soon building new coal-fired power stations, and even we're doing it. So, yeah. Anyway.
Patsy had a question.
Yes.
Thank you very much. It's been a really interesting session. I guess I'm really cynical about the technology roadmap, and I guess I'm echoing what Annette Cowie said, that what it's doing is suggesting that we don't have to change anything. The technology will fill in the gaps, and we can go on living exactly as we have. And the more modeling we do, in some ways, reinforces that notion that it'll all be solved if we just put more money into the right studies and into the right technologies. And I guess I'm pretty cynical about that as a strategy for reaching, for saving.
I share your cynicism, and I'm very disappointed that that seems to be Australia's tactic. If you read that document, it actually starts at the beginning by saying, this plan does not mean that we will stop coal and gas production. Apparently, we're planning to just keep doing it because we think we can do carbon capture and storage to solve the problem.
Which is more expensive.
Yes, it's more expensive.
Even if it worked, it would be so expensive that we couldn't do it for our household energy.
Well, they say that they're going to pay $20 billion to the industry to support them to do that. So this is the not taxing, right? So what they're going to do is they're going to tax us in order to raise this $20 billion so that then they can give it to the fossil fuel industry. Okay. I don't know why we're not hearing that in the media. It's frightful.
Okay.
Well, on that bright note, we've reached 8:30. So perhaps we might just kind of look for a closing note of optimism. Annette, have you got one there?
Not from Australia, but let's look at the rest of the world. Because there was a delightful piece by Annabelle Crabb on the weekend, basically pointing to the fact that ScoMo didn't have to do much because, well, the states and industry are already doing it for him. So it wouldn't have even hurt him to come in with a stricter target because it's going to happen anyway. So the world is on board, even if some of the leaders are not. And I think that's the bright thing that's happening there.
Yeah, and I'd also like to acknowledge, I do think that council's making steps in a good direction currently with their seeking to put parameters around the renewable energy rollout and with trying to assist the process of the community gaining renewable benefits from the renewable energy zone, including the potential to access renewable energy. Let's look forward to perhaps some community energy generation projects. And there was actually prioritisation of that through the ESAC committee of a project towards community energy through the renewable energy zone. So that's great. And I think we should all be participating in what's happening in council with and getting our views and thoughts in relating to the community strategic planning process that's happening at the moment. But anyway, thank you very much for coming and for your presentation, and it's really great to hear it very clearly presented. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. It's been lovely to see you all and have a chat about it.
Lovely.
Thank
you.
Yeah, I'd also just like to say good to see you here, Brad. Haven't